Good evening. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. I'm David Ware, and I'm on the clergy team here, and I'm so happy to welcome you this evening to this Lent's version of our Voices series. Voices brings together voices of speakers, of teachers, of writers, artists, theologians, you name it, who are interested in holding the beauty and the pain of our lives together at once and finding in that the promise of what might be. Today's speaker is I'm not going to say his name because I'm not going to introduce him. This happens a lot of times. I'm invited to introduce the person who's going to introduce the person, right? So I'm going to introduce to you Tim Baker. Tim Baker was confirmed at Redeemer in 1956, and he's been in our pews since he returned to Baltimore in 2017, and he gave one of our Voices talks in 2019 about the investigation and prosecution of Spiro Agnew. Many of you were probably here for that. Tim runs the Iliad Adult Education Series at Roland Park Place, and it's in that capacity that he's gotten to know our speaker this evening, Professor Richard Bell. So, Tim, please come and introduce.
Good evening. Is that better? Yes. Okay. One of my most brilliant moves as the impresario at the Iliad program was to persuade Rick to teach a course on the New York Times 1619 report and critical race theory. He taught that course in the fall of 2021, and the course was so popular that people would hear about it after it had already begun in several lectures. Rick had already given several lectures. People would hear about it from friends, and they would register and pay the tuition, and even though they were a couple of sessions late. And then last fall, Rick taught another 8-lecture course in Iliad on the effect of the American Revolution around the British Empire, around the world, and for other people. And I've already retained him to teach a course next fall. Rick brings an unusual perspective to American history. He's British. He received his BA from Cambridge University. But since then, this former redcoat has crossed the Atlantic and joined the American Revolutionaries. He got his PhD in American history from Harvard University. He now is professor of history at the University of Maryland, and he's an American citizen. Tonight he will talk about his book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. The book was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Prize and the 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize. Many of you have heard him lecture in Iliad and elsewhere. The rest of you, indeed all of us, are in for a real treat tonight. Rick?
Wow, I should really have Tim introduce me at all my undergraduate lectures as well. That would be really helpful, I think, riling up the crowd. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much, David, for this invitation. Thank you to all of you coming out on what is a pretty chilly, windy night to this beautiful place to hear this difficult and often not beautiful true story from American history. So thank you for your attention and care for this story. I'm going to talk about this research, the research I've spent the last 10 years of my life conducting and then writing up for about 35 minutes. And then for me, the really interesting stuff happens after that when I get to hear what you think about this and you get to make comments and questions that I can try to keep up with. And I think we have a microphone there so you can do that. So I hope you'll be forthright and full of questions about all of this. Let's get started. This, of course, is difficult, serious stuff. There are no jokes in the next 35 minutes, because Cornelius Sinclair was just 10 years old, and yet he was trapped. He was locked. He was stuck in the belly of a small ship that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, about a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's marketplace just an hour ago, shoved a gag into the kid's mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him aboard. And it was dark below the ship's waterline, but Cornelius could see just enough to know that he was not the only child locked down there. 4 other pairs of eyes stared back at him, 4 other African-American children. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was smaller and shorter than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8 years old. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were enslaved. They were prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep, deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his friends or his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August of 1825. He was one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances that single year alone. In the early 1800s, the city of Philadelphia was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Philadelphia's gridded streets, Philadelphia's tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids into Southern slaves. These kidnappers did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time, not just as the city of brotherly love, but as a safe haven for people of color and as the headquarters of America's anti-slavery movement at the time. But of course, to criminals, to kidnappers, none of that mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And of course, this was a product of its location. Philadelphia was the nearest major free soil city on the East Coast to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, including, of course, Maryland, where I and presumably you live. As Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary across Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, Pennsylvania's southern border, the Mason-Dixon line, seemed to divide 2 worlds, separating northern free soil states from the southern slave states beyond it. And Philadelphia's close proximity to that frontier line made the city's many free black residents very attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states. They preyed on the members of this community's free black population relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. The people they stole away from liberty could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, 3 of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this same time in American history. The settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut their sugarcane and pick their cotton, and they would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Now, buying a small percentage of their forced laborers from kidnappers of free black northerners was not likely their first choice, but their options were limited. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808. That was the year that lawmakers in Washington had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of African-descended people from Africa itself or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them here in the United States. That 1808 decision, cutting off the legal supply from the transatlantic slave trade, was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America. Because by cutting off legal foreign supplies of enslaved people, it spurred the growth of a replacement. It spurred the growth of an American slave trade, a domestic slave trade, an internal slave trade within the slave states already in the U.S., in which planters in the Chesapeake, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware would sell some of their surplus laborers, as they saw them, to professional middlemen, slave traders, who would then take them south to try to satisfy these southwestern settlers' demands for black labor. And that was all legal. The legal selling and buying of enslaved people from places like Maryland down to places like Mississippi. The domestic slave trade was entirely legal. It was responsible for the forced migration of approximately 1 million enslaved African Americans from our region down to the Mississippi region. But planters down in the Deep South wanted even more than that legal trade could provide. And the stronger their demand for captive labor, the more tempting, the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children like Cornelius Sinclair from northern cities like Philadelphia, launder them into that legal supply chain I just described, and then try and sell them in that vast new southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of a nationwide kidnapping operation. It had become the largest northern depot of something I call America's reverse underground railroad. So when I use that phrase tonight, reverse underground railroad, I'm referring to what I just described, the kidnapping of black Americans, typically from northern towns and cities, for the purposes of selling and enslaving them in the Deep South. And this reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, ran in opposite directions, of course, and existed for completely different reasons. But because they are opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of each other. On the Underground Railroad, the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one, enslaved people abandoned southern gulags and trekked northward, dreaming of new lives, new opportunities in freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free black people were stolen from northern cities like Philadelphia and made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their lives and their own liberty to help black fugitives make these extraordinary journeys toward freedom. While on America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated simply by money. Both networks, one obviously heroic and courageous, the other obviously monstrous and evil, both networks roared to life in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the northern states versus the southern states. Both networks were loosely organized and highly opportunistic. Both networks ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, false identities, even disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and the routes taken by victims of kidnapping made to go south, the routes were often the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was also roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of black adults and children across state lines, half of them towards freedom, the other half made to walk towards slavery. I think most Americans by now in 2023 know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad. Historians have spent decades studying the strategies and the tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. Their achievements now finally command widespread attention, which is a wonderful thing. And there are Underground Railroad walking tours and television shows and museums. There was even a big Harriet Tubman movie right before the pandemic that many of us have seen. All of this stuff is dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. And yet I think we know far less about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable, and the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even now. These kidnappers certainly never gave public lectures about their work. They never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names and their crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile and surviving legal records, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, protected by vastly too much indifference and apathy among ordinary white civilians who knew what they were doing and did nothing to stop it. The outlaws who built America's reverse Underground Railroad left no business records or bundles of thick private letters for historians to read in the Library of Congress. These kidnappers did not write memoirs about their careers. They did not pose for paintings or photographs, leaving journalists and activists of the era to simply guess as to what some of them might have looked like. But as I argue in my new book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in the book begins, but about each and every town or city with a free black population, if we think not just about 1825, when the true story I tell in the book begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free black people from their families and from freedom. Many of them children like Cornelius who were under the age of 16. And let me be crystal clear here. Most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched for them frantically. They lobbied, they petitioned, they advertised, they waited in earnest for any sort of news. But usually nothing, and no one came back. We have a large group of people here. I'm guessing all of you have heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie, came out 10 years ago, by the way, that was based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northup. He, of course, was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Solomon Northup later escaped his enslavement, and I think you all know how many years it took him to escape, right? But he did it. It took him 12 years, but he did it, which is very unusual. And when he got home, he wrote about it all in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. And in that memoir, which he published in 1853, Solomon Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed white con men lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Solomon Northup was a well-educated, literate, employed, prosperous musician. He was in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, these two con men wined him and dined him. And if you remember the movie, you'll remember they drugged him too, and then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C., and Northup was soon forced aboard a slave ship that was bound for New Orleans, and he was there sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his sugarcane fields. And 10 years ago, in 2013, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to Northup's ordeal. But I am here to tell you that the memoir and the movie offer misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. Folks, it turns out that Northup's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. Its kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. No, they preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with tricks and ruses that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship down to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls they abducted to trek southward on their own 2 feet in small, specialized overland convoys known as coffles. Their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. Their prisoners were vastly more likely to be sold off in ones and twos along the way, in furtive all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or the interior of Alabama, to men who wanted to buy and own more human beings, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto that little ship just outside Philadelphia that I mentioned when I began. Their captors then warehoused them for a couple of weeks in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line. If you know where the Nanticoke River is in Sussex County, then that's exactly the borderline that I am talking about between Delaware and Maryland. And then their kidnappers marched them halfway across this vast, vast continent toward the Deep South, where they tried to sell these 5 free children as slaves. This was, for those boys, a soul-destroying journey. If you're a child of 10 years old, it's a journey of 2 million footsteps. In the book, I have a lot to say about it. Tonight, I'm going to pass over much of that journey. And I'm also going to pass over, because my publisher requires me to pass over, much of the book's second half, in which readers do learn that some, though not all, of these 5 boys made a miraculous escape and began the astonishing Odyssey home referenced in the book's subtitle. All I can say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen next was indeed astonishing. It was astonishing to them as they made it happen. It was astonishing to me tracking them 200 years later. It would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the grave, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. Now, instead of breaking my legal promise to my publisher and telling you everything that happens in the book, there are still a few copies out front. Let me just quickly note here that the full story of what did happen next is a story that's never before been told. And of course, for understandable reasons. Think about it. Cornelius was a child at the time. Cornelius came from a hard-up family that was not the sort to leave behind many traces in fancy libraries and archives. And this is a problem, of course, because this is a true story. This is history. It's not fiction. And historians need sources, lots and lots of primary sources, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true, in ways that are fair. And the stories and the struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers and diaries and memoirs often remain unstudied, untold, as a result of the lack of readily available sources. So to reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing all that I could from a small packet of letters written to or from the mayor of Philadelphia, a public official who wades into this story at the very last moment, and from coverage of Cornelius's abduction in a single anti-slavery newspaper that gave a damn at the time. Now, to be clear, historians have long known about these mayoral letters and these newspaper pieces, but on their own, those two sources proved to be too few in number and too thin in substance to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing odyssey into and out of American slavery. So I had to keep going. I had to go looking elsewhere. I had to dig around in literally any archive I could think of for scraps of other information, new information, that when stitched together might help me flesh this all out. And I can tell you here that along the way there's been a lot of days in archives far away from here in which I found nothing useful at all, looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only lots and lots of hay. If you've done your own genealogical and historical research, you will recognize that, that sensation. But of course you should keep at it, because eventually you will find those needles. And that was ultimately what happened to me. I did at least 6 years of research for this book before I started writing any part of it. And in the course of those 6 years on the road, I was able to unearth dozens and dozens of needles, buried at the bottom, usually, of those haystacks. New sources about this case, buried within 35 archives in 14 states and the District of Columbia. And the good news is, I'm not going to list them all for you here. But I will tell you about 3 ever so quickly. One thing I found was the handwritten notes of a trial that took place all the way down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial that would decide the fate of one of these 5 boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. The second thing I found was a pair of letters authored by one of the kidnappers, in which this man names his accomplices and describes their roles in this specific kidnapping. A find so amazing, I'm waiting for someone to accuse me of making it up. I copied it into the back of the book so you can read it for yourself. And third, I want to tell you about a source I found pretty early on. I found it in a Philadelphia newspaper, which for me has always been the most affecting of the sources I found for this story. It's on page 8 of the paperback. You probably can't see it, but it is a missing persons notice. It's very short, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, it is feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at the following address, Joseph Sinclair." As you can imagine, I've read that ad literally hundreds of times in my life. And every time I read that ad, every single time, all I can focus on, all I can hear, all I can see are 2 of those words, which jump out at me like they're 60 foot high, like they're written in neon on the side of a building: afflicted parents. All of us are children of parents. Many of us are parents of children or parents of grandchildren. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. The thought that my children could be taken from me, ripped away from my wife and I, and there'd been absolutely nothing meaningful we could do to get them back or hope to see them again, that just rips at me in the most basic human way. Afflicted parents. To me, that is the understatement of the 19th century. Before we turn to your questions, and I do hope you come up and ask some questions or make some comments, let me wrap up with a couple of brief reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on this railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free American children ripped from their American families and swallowed up by American slavery is a story worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many, many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities, and that black freedom was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade played in accelerating the spread of slavery into the Deep South over this same critical period. Now, as I said, I'm not at liberty to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half or tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. You can find the book in your local library, your local independent bookstore, all the usual places. But in case you don't ever read the book, let me at least drop a few big hints here. And let me say here that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save Cornelius and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies, and the aftermath of their campaign, would radicalize black communities across the free soil states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense, their own mutual protection. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists to focus the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of black families forcibly separated by kidnappers, by slave catchers, by slave traders, by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And this 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage not only kidnappers, but Southerners and slaveholders, more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War, and it set in motion a chain of court challenges against it and political retaliations against it that would culminate in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery, pro-kidnapping abomination that put this country on a collision course with civil war. To conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him, and the things that he and the other boys made happen, would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy must never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children will be dragged into slavery. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. Thank you very much indeed. So David can give us any cues he wants, but I certainly encourage people to engage in any way you see fit. There's a microphone here for your convenience. We encourage you to come up and use it. Comments and questions, anything is welcome. And please say your name. Please introduce yourself.
Peter Bain, Rick, thanks for coming tonight. The 1808 reference is appreciated because it's, my memory is that's yet another component of the peculiar bargain of the Constitution, where they negotiated out a 20-year exemption in 1788, but then said, look, importation stops. So I think there's a case to be made that it's pretty foreseeable, right? You have 20-year warning that there's going to be a fundamental shift in the economics of slavery in 1808. And I'm just curious, in your research, did you find anything that indicated, that these people who are about to be victims of kidnapping, they weren't voters more than likely, but they sure were citizens, that any government took any action, in fact, to protect them for a period of time before we get,
right.
Fugitive Slave Act?
Thank you for that excellent question. With the microphone, I assume everyone heard the question. Is that right? Okay, good. So I won't repeat the questions because we have a microphone here. So kidnapping of free people is illegal in every state of the Union throughout U.S. History. Kidnapping will be illegal in Pennsylvania from pretty much the get-go. It will be illegal in Maryland. It will be illegal in Mississippi, too. It's just not legal to kidnap free people. But does that stop it happening, especially when those people are black? Of course it does not, as we heard tonight. And what we can say is that, in fact, the passage of a law closing off American legal participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 was actually not inevitable. I think we've often read that back that way. But if a close reading of the Constitution says, and you're absolutely correct about this, that future legislators cannot interfere with the transatlantic slave trade in any shape, any meaningful shape or form, for fully 20 years after the Constitution becomes the law of the land. The Constitution becomes the law of the land roughly in 1788, so 20 plus years takes us to 1808, which actually is the date spelled out. So 1808 is what it says in the Constitution. You cannot interfere with the transatlantic slave trade until 1808. But what it does not say, and we've often assumed that it did say this, but it didn't. What it does not say is that after 1808, the transatlantic slave trade will be outlawed. It just protects that trade until 1808 and then says, whatever happens after that happens. Maybe the transatlantic slave trade will remain legal for another 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. Maybe it'll be abolished right away. James Madison, will be dead. I won't care. He's probably not dead, but you get the general point, right? They're leaving it for future generations to figure out what happens next. But all they're saying is you cannot touch the legality of the slave trade until 1808. Now, as the gentleman knows, when 1808 does roll around, actually 1806, Congress and its president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, do decide to act. They can't act before the 1st of January 1808, but they do act at the first opportunity. And so you could argue that that was foreseeable. I would say it's not foreseeable. Trying to second guess what Jefferson is going to do is a fool's game most of the time. And of course, when it comes to pass, the reasons why those legislators do decide to act to abolish legal participation in the transatlantic slave trade are not the reasons you may be imagining in your head. It's not because these federal leaders think that the transatlantic slave trade is abhorrent. It's not because they think it's a crime. It's not because they think it's immoral. It's because they think it's unwelcome competition for Maryland slave owners and Virginia slave owners and Delaware slave owners who want to sell some of their surplus laborers down to Mississippi and do not want to compete with foreign imports. Remember, the president who signs this is Thomas Jefferson. Is he actively anti-slavery? If he was, that would be news to the hundreds of people he enslaved at that moment, right? So there are real sort of chronologically specific reasons for why this happens the way it does, which means that free black people are somewhat blindsided by it and by the other changes that happen. And certainly no state legislature is their reliable ally in this period, which is the other big part of a response to your question. Thank you for that. Please, come on up. Yeah.
Thank you again for a great lecture. Proud attendee to your 1619 and Revolution lectures. Looking forward to your upcoming lectures. So the issue of economic motivation is clear, but such atrocities, and really building a bit on the previous gentleman's comment, can only take place by either the passive or overt permission of society in general. And more recently, I've been reading a book entitled Caste. And I can't help but think 200 years later, we still have these atrocities played out in different ways. They may be police shootings, but they're still acts of aggression. And I'm wondering how you view this issue of caste, which has haunted us throughout history and is usually assigned to multiple issues. It could be religion, and the author makes a strong case for Hinduism and caste system and for Nazism and other rapid caste things such as Germany, but 200 years plus in our society. How do you view that issue? Because it's another perspective on the economic considerations that we, probably most of us in the room, really understand, and you've talked so passionately about movingly in this lecture. So please give me your views on this. I'm eager to hear.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll certainly do my best. The book the gentleman was referencing is Caste, C-A-S-T-E, by Isabel Wilkerson, a very well-regarded journalist, most famous for writing The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration. I've not yet read Caste, so I'm not going to pass any sort of judgment upon it, but that's the book the gentleman was referencing there. Let's make a quick comment about the past and then a quick comment about the present. I fear that neither comment will be brief, but I'll try. The first is to expand on something I said in passing, which links to the gentleman's observation, right? That it's not just cold, hard economics. It's the culture in which those calculations are being made that allow this seemingly systematic atrocity against free black Americans to occur under white Americans' noses, right? This book begins in Philadelphia, which is a free soil city. Similar kidnappings happened in every free soil city. So these happened too in New York, they happened too in Boston, they happened in Cleveland, Chicago, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, you name a city, I'll provide evidence that kidnappings like this happened there. And it wasn't just in northern free soil cities, it was actually any city that has a free black population. Baltimore, Maryland is part of a slave state, but Baltimore in the 1820s has a very large free black population. Are they being targeted by these same gangs? Absolutely. Absolutely they are. In fact, after Philly, Baltimore City probably faces the largest threat from these kidnappers, just so you know. So how does this happen? Well, if we think about, southern slave states like Maryland, then we can of course say, well, all the white people in a community, they probably were raised on the idea that African-descended people are naturally inferior to them, and so anything that happens to African-descended people, even something as vicious as kidnapping, is probably some version of God's plan, or just the way it is, or par for the course if you're black in America. And what I want to tell you is those same racist attitudes were no less prevalent north of the Mason-Dixon line. They were no less prevalent in the great city of Philadelphia or New York or Boston or surrounding regions. I'll just give you an example from Delaware to prove this point. I read a newspaper from Wilmington, Delaware, which prides itself on being more like Philly than like Baltimore in this time. And there was a newspaper in Delaware called the American Watchman, and I was reading it for 1817, and I came across a letter to the editor from some local white resident, and the letter to the editor said, "My God, I'm hearing about so many kidnappings of free black people, even children. Can you believe it? Something must be done. So I've got an idea. We should find who these kidnappers are. We should find where they live, so that we can give them a 5-year tax break for the important service they're providing in ridding the state of Delaware of this horrible black underclass. They are doing us a favor by stripping out this element." People are saying that in the paper in public, right? And signing their names at the bottom. You can find broadly similar writings anywhere you look. So slavery can be abolished. Slavery can be dead and illegal north of the Mason-Dixon line or around it, but it doesn't mean that racism is annihilated or eliminated from those places. Racism is the air people breathe in 1820s America. So there's that. To skip forward to the present day, of course, we could go in any number of directions. So instead of making a comment here about the continuing struggles of African-descended people in this country, which I think are evident to anyone with a brain and eyes and a heart, I want to mention that slavery itself and human trafficking, which is no longer racialized in quite the same way as it was in the 1820s, continues to be a pervasive threat to free people around the world and in this country today. NGOs like Free the Slaves or Amnesty International or Polaris estimate that today, I think it's March the 8th, maybe, 2023, that today somewhere between 20 and 40 million people woke up in some form of actual slavery around the world today. It may not look like pre-Civil War antebellum plantation slavery. It could be domestic slavery. It could be sex slavery. It could be agricultural slavery. It could be debt slavery. But it's slavery nevertheless, in the sense that people cannot escape or make choices to leave it. And within the United States, that number is not zero. We might assume it is, but of course we know secretly it's not, right? We know that modern-day human trafficking happens under our noses. You may know that New York and Washington are, alongside Atlanta, the three major centers for human trafficking and modern-day slavery in North America. And that the numbers of people who woke up in one of those four forms of modern-day slavery today is approximately 100,000 people in America today woke up in some real form of slavery. And I mention this because even though I'm sure I'd be preaching to the choir about Black Lives Matter and the value of fighting racism, I also want to say when it comes to slavery, that fight is not over either. I think many of us think that if we were alive in 1825, we'd be one of the good guys, right? We'd be one of the abolitionists. Oh yeah, me and William Lloyd Garrison, me and Frederick Douglass, we'd be kicking you-know-what around the place. The sad truth is back then, the population of the United States was, let's make up a number, about 10 million people. No more than 100,000 people were ever members of anti-slavery organizations. So if we were the US population, it would be like, the front row only would be the actual abolitionists. Congratulations, you three. Sorry, I should have chosen a different row, perhaps. It's a fantasy to say that joining the fight is easy, but there's a fight going on right now. There's the BLM fight, which we all should join, but there's also a fight against actual slavery today as well, which is equally perhaps important. If you've ever said to yourself, if I lived back then, I would have been one of the anti-slavery people, You can be one of the anti-slavery people now, actually. You can support any of these organizations I just named, Polaris, Amnesty International, Free the Slaves. You can learn about these issues as you're doing with contemporary diversity issues as well, and then you can wade in, because if you don't, no one else is going to. So thanks for raising those issues. Go ahead.
Thank you for tonight and being here with us. Two things. The first is regarding your last statement about trafficking so it reminds me of something Dr. King said when he talked about the reciprocity, the web of intermutuality that exists in human life, period, and how we're all connected. And so injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's basically what we're seeing. We just get to be the scapegoats for it, usually. But when you are being unjust to any one person, it's like fascism. You set it up for everybody. But that's not why I came. Here's my question for you. In West Africa, there's a term called Sankofa. Go back and get it. So my question to you as a historian, having now gone back and coming forward, what do you bring forward for us for now, for the future? You could speak to that.
Okay, so I think, if I understand, thank you for the wonderful comment and question. I appreciate it. History doesn't repeat itself. That's a cheap slogan that is basically meaningless. History doesn't repeat itself. But history does echo with our present moment, and history rhymes from time to time as well. And circumstances we find ourselves in now can be better understood and better responded to, navigated through with a keener understanding of the past, not least because if you think that everything today is brand new, then you're sort of whitewashing all the struggles of people in the past to begin with, or imagining that our present struggles are a blip and temporary and things will go back to normal at some point, which I think is wishful thinking at this point. But in terms of the anti-slavery fight, which is one of the struggles at the heart of this book, I can say just a couple of observations, and then you can decide whether they're meaningful lessons to apply today. One is that people wait in vain for powerful institutional allies to step up and do something. If you're waiting for the government to act, whether that is your local government or your federal government or the United Nations, you may be waiting a long time. You may die before that happens. So we can all hope that our governments are more responsive to suffering, but history tells us that that's not always the case. So if you're looking for meaningful responses, they have to start with you, that people make change and governments struggle to play catch-up. Institutions struggle to play catch-up. So that would be one thing. And then I will also make the other, I think, pretty straightforward point, which is that there have been so many challenges that the American people in all our rich variety have faced over the years, often from our, fellow Americans and other neighbors. And it can be tempting to see American history as a bottomless pit of despair. And I certainly understand that impulse. I teach slavery every day of my life to college kids. There's a part of that which is fundamentally depressing. But my urge is not to then whitewash it or minimize it or wish it wasn't there, which is an impulse we're seeing playing out in a state further south of here with legislative ideas about not teaching things. My impulse as a teacher is to remind young people that people who were subjected to these horrors and the people that loved them and recognized them as fellow human beings or God's children in a religious context frequently did extraordinary things to protest, to say no, to resist, to oppose. Oftentimes, those things were remarkably nonviolent pleas for humanity and fellow feeling. And so your invocation of Dr. King is very apropos of that. And at the other end of the spectrum, when all other avenues were exhausted, people like John Brown or Frederick Douglass or Nat Turner or Harriet Tubman chose violence as a last resort to save themselves and save the people they loved from a fate they considered worse than the violence they were inflicting on others. There have been a range of responses to racial terror in this country, and I think all of them are valid because racial terror is a monster that we can't let outlive us, I think. So I wake up with a great degree of optimism seems like too strong a word, but energy to continue this fight. Because if we don't continue this fight, then we are overtaken by it. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you would be willing to, yes, thank you. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share personally, as you're in the archives over a number of years, encountering these incredibly ugly truths, could you share about personally how you carried that and about your process of grief?
Yeah, so how does one navigate through this research process was the question, emotionally, I guess, as well as other things. If my wife was here, she'd scowl at me a lot because we've been married a long time. And she would be the first to nod when I say that I have the sort of brain or heart that, for better or frequently for worse, allows me to put things in boxes. And I don't let those boxes cross-contaminate each other, or you'd never get out of bed in the morning. So that's a part of my psychology which is specific to me, which when you deal with dark stuff can actually, I find, be very useful, that I can work on tough stuff and be with it and present, and then I can go and play soccer with my kids, and then I can go back to it, right? I have that sort of brain. My wife says that is a shortcoming. I would say that is useful. Anyway, but to come at the point a different way. This is not the book I set out to write, or at least not the book I thought I was writing when I set out. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before. How I came to this project was through the back door. I was finishing a previous book about another equally dark subject, about people who take their own lives in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War. This is when remembering how my brain works is important. And as I was finishing up that project about this very dark topic of suicide, I became aware, someone sent me a news clipping from an old 1829 newspaper, also from Delaware. And the newspaper clipping told the story of the alleged suicide of a woman on trial for murder in a rural jail in Georgetown, Delaware, if some of you know where that is. And she committed suicide in jail, allegedly, to avoid, the judge passing down a death sentence on her. She'd escaped the hangman, so the piece said. Now, it wasn't clear that she had committed suicide, but I began digging in to the circumstances of her death to try and figure that out. I ultimately concluded that she hadn't. She died of natural causes. She was like 65 years old, which back then, it was like being 105 today. She was pretty old and had some health problems. Her name was Patty Cannon. If any of you happen to have read the book, you will recognize that name. I became aware of her notoriety as I was investigating the circumstances of her death. Because during her life, well, first of all, I'll say she was on trial for murdering 3 people, 2 of whom were apparently rival kidnappers and slave traders. Because during her life, Patty Cannon, who died at the age of 65, a white lady in Delaware, had been, for the last 10 years, the co-leader of the most well-known and most active gang of professional kidnappers of black people anywhere in the United States. She'd inherited that business from her husband, who had died a few years earlier. His name was Jesse Cannon. He'd run it with his son-in-law, Joseph Johnson. It was called the Cannon-Johnson Gang. And by the time she died, Patty Cannon was so well known as this, how do you say it, bogeyman, one of them, I'm British, that every free black person within 50 miles had heard the name Patty Cannon and knew to keep their children away from anything that smelled of Patty. In fact, some parents, black parents, would apparently try to scare their children by saying, Patty's going to get you, which is a terrible thing to say, because often she did. So I had never heard of Patty Cannon when I discovered the circumstances of her death. And as I became aware of her career as a kidnapper, I became aware of just how many other kidnapping gangs there were, just like hers, that I was equally ignorant of. There were dozens and dozens of these gangs operating across the United States, literally anywhere there are free black people. I knew nothing of this in 2011 or whatever year it was. And by then, I'd been a professional historian for like 15 years. How embarrassing is that I didn't know that? So I started to write a book to put this story, this phenomenon of the kidnapping of free black people into slavery by white-led gangs before a broader readership. And I thought, aha, the vehicle I'll use is I'll write a biography of this woman, this Patty Cannon, this awful monster, and make her my subject. But I'm sure most of us have read at least some biography of Hitler at some point in our lives. If you've ever heard biographers of Hitler talk about their process, they all say that it's the most insufferable, intolerable experience they've ever had, to live with a monster for however many years they're doing that. And I was 2 years into this project of writing a bio of Patty as it started to even eat away at me. And I had these boxes, these watertight hulks, bulkheads in my head. But it was even sloshing over the bulkheads, and I didn't want to get up and do this work any day. I hated being in Patty's brain. I hated being on her shoulder. I hated seeing the world through her eyes. So I realized this was untenable for my mental health as much as anything else. And so at some point, I made the decision that I was going to pivot dramatically away from Patty and try to zero in on the experiences of some of the people to whom she'd done these things and try to understand it from their point of view. That's easier said than done, because most of the people she kidnapped were never heard from again. They didn't get free. They didn't, write letters to the mayor of Philadelphia. They didn't have a court case in Tuscaloosa. But these 5 boys, they did. They did have those things. Some of them have what we might call, if we squint, a happy ending to this story. And their attempts to free themselves generated records, some of which were from their perspective. We have 2 1,000-word-long accounts from 2 of the 5 boys, one of the rarest of things. Outside of Solomon Northup's memoir, we otherwise have nothing from victims of this. But we have these 2 boys' accounts. So those boys' accounts became my Bibles, and I tried to put them and the other boys at the center of the story. And even though the resulting tale, I think, is still pretty damn harrowing for me as a writer, hope with any luck for you as a feeling person, it was also a lot better for my mental health and sanity to realize that these boys' experiences were what I got up with thinking about. And I was rooting for them every day rather than getting up and wishing Patty Cannon would hurry up and die.
Thank you for your commentary. Could you talk a little bit about whether you found any evidence of women or girls being kidnapped, and what the ratio was, if you have any information on that?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. So again, I will do my best to be brief, knowing that I will fail. So I often, when I'm talking about this book, I often talk about the 5 free boys, Cornelius, Sam, Alex, Enos, and Joe, because they're in the title of the book. If you look at the book, they're in the title. But if you read the book, you know that 2 adult women were also taken along on this horrific cross-country trip. One of them was a free black woman who was kidnapped, just like the 5 boys were, and one of them was an enslaved woman who was legally purchased and carried along with them, in part so they could forge paperwork based on her legit paperwork, just so you know. And I don't often do a good job of making sure I talk about those 2 women, Mary Fisher and Mary Neal, when I'm giving talks like this. So I want to remind everyone there are 2 adult women who also make this journey in this story. And that's a reminder to all of us that women too, girls too, were subject to these same predations. Let me say 2 things about that. One is that, of course, demand for women and girls in the plantation South, in the Deep South, was very robust. In fact, that region, the Deep South, the Cotton South, would be the region where demand for women and girls was actually highest compared to the Chesapeake or the coastal South. And that's because of the cash crop that would develop in the Deep South. The cash crop in the Deep South is going to be cotton, as opposed to tobacco and wheat around here, or as opposed to indigo and rice in South Carolina. To pick some of those other crops, you need a great deal of to cultivate those other crops, you need a great deal of physical strength. Imagine sugar in the Caribbean. You're literally hacking down thick sugar cane with a machete. It's going to break your back even if you're a very strong adult man. But to pick cotton, all it takes is physical stamina, being willing to stand up for 12 hours a day, and it takes digital dexterity. It takes finger power. So we know from economic historians that the most valuable enslaved laborers on most cotton plantations were not 25-year-old men all buffed up. They were 13, 14-year-old girls, often slips of a thing, who were perfectly built physically in the eyes of slaveholders to stand and pick, day, day, day. If any of you have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, which again is based on true events, you may remember that the lead female character is a woman called Patsy, who's played by the brilliant British Kenyan actress Lupita Nyong'o. The real Patsy was a real person, and the real Patsy was bought when she was 13 and quickly proved herself to be the most valuable laborer on that cotton gulag. So I'm saying, first of all, that if you are kidnapping people to try to sell them into that market, you're just as interested in kidnapping young girls as you are in kidnapping young boys, like the boys in my book. Both can find ready buyers and be put to cotton work. And then the other dimension, which you've probably anticipated, of course, is the sexual dimension of this. It will be no surprise to anyone in this room that many buyers of black people's life and labor put a premium on young, pretty girls, knowing full well that once they owned them, they would rape them. Because this happened thousands and thousands and thousands of times under the banner of American slavery. So we know that legal slave traders often were able to get buyers to pay almost double for light-skinned pretty girls of a certain age. And the traders would not only wash them before they sold them, as they did for any enslaved person before they sold them, to spruce them up. When it was a young, pretty girl, they thought we could sell as a fancy girl, which is the code of the euphemism of the day for sex slave, fancy girl. They would not only wash them and spruce them up, they would also braid their hair and put ribbons in their hair as well to make these children, these girls, even more appealing to the lascivious male buyers. So the gender dynamics of this are absolutely atrocious, obviously, and I do talk about many of them in my book and in my scholarship as well. I try to show you that there are hundreds of other cases, thousands of other cases, and women and girls are well represented. Tim Baker, we should probably start to wrap up. Last point, okay.
Rick, people here tonight might be interested in your telling us how it was that you, in a British university and a British upbringing and nationality, became an American historian.
Because you called me a redcoat earlier on, remember? How did this redcoat betray his country and join Team USA? Tim Baker wants to know. Former US attorney. Very quickly, and thank you for the softball question to end this very difficult conversation. I am British. My parents, I was born in North London. Both my parents still live halfway between London and Cambridge. If you've ever been to Stansted Airport, London's third airport, my parents live a mile away from there. My sister works at the National Portrait Gallery in central London, which is closed for a 3-year renovation. I went to college wanting to be an historian because I'd had a really good teacher in 10th grade. Up until that, I'd had a succession of terrible, terrible history teachers, which made me really hate history with a passion and think it's just learning names and dates. How is this a thing people want to do? And I remember taking a career aptitude test at some point in my, let's say, 10th grade. But did you all do this when you were in school? You take one of these silly tests where they don't ask you what you want to be. They say, you know, if you've got a wrench and a beach ball, how do you make an airplane? Or what's your third favorite color? And then they tell you what career you definitely should do based on your answers. And I remember filling that out, and I remember getting the results back. And the context here is that my father is a retired accountant. Both my uncles are retired accountants. My grandfather was, guess what, a retired accountant. So I do this aptitude test, and it spits back these careers. And number one, it says accountant. And so when I finally got a good history teacher and decided that maybe a college major in history was in my future, this felt like a daring teenage rebellion against the fates. And so I went to college in England at University of Cambridge. I got a fabulous education. And mostly I studied medieval European history because the way it was taught there was peasants, sex, and violence. And I was like 19. I was like, oh, yes, sex and violence. And it was gripping, and I loved it. And by senior year, I'd run out of college courses in medieval Europe full of sex and violence. I'd taken them all already. But I still needed, I think, 3 or 6 credits to graduate, so I'm looking around for some other course where I can do a bit of sex and violence, but it doesn't meet too early in the day. Nothing before 11, please. And I find this course on the history of colonial America. And I take this course with a professor named Betty Wood, who passed away 2 years ago. And not only did she fill it with sex and violence, God bless her, but she also made me realize that American history is completely fascinating. There's far more of it than any European has ever imagined, and that it's really important. That what happens in American history matters, not just to those of us who now live in America, but to people around the world as well. And so she got me hooked on that one course. And so on the basis of that, I went deep into American history, and I decided to get a PhD in American history. And once you make that decision, going to America to get one starts to make a lot of sense. So I had the enormous fortune of going to Harvard University, working with some brilliant historians, among them Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She's the one whose bumper sticker reads, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." That's her. These were astonishing historians who taught me everything I know about this discipline. And I thought when I went to America to get this degree, I'd go there for however many years it would took, and then I'd get back on a plane and go and find a job teaching American history, let's say in London if I'm lucky. And of course it turns out that people outside of America, they really don't care about American history. The number of jobs for historians of colonial America in Europe, you know, could count on one big hand with a lot of fingers. Not that many jobs. So as that dawning realization about the job market was dawning on me over the next 7 years, I was starting to realize that maybe that wasn't the best plan. And of course, at the same time, they put me in my first year in graduate student housing because I was new to the city. So they put me up in institutional housing. And they put all the international students there, along with a scattering of domestic students from other states to sort of help the foreigners acclimatize. And you know, one of the US students is now my wife. We met in the first week of graduate school. We didn't start dating right away, but we met in the first week of graduate school. And she's a terrifying woman from Missouri. I would say that to her face, but then I would duck as well. And we have 2 terrifyingly American children, as I mentioned in the thing, who can, by the way, do an excellent British accent, both my children, but they will only do it if they're making fun of their father. So they do it quite regularly, actually. But I'll just end by saying that this was never my plan to end up here speaking to you about this or to living this extraordinary life I've had the fortune to lead. And I genuinely love my job at Maryland, teaching wonderful students. But my mother tells the story, and this is where I'll end, that when she and my dad took me to Heathrow to send me on my way for my first semester of graduate school over in Boston, I was thinking, you know, I'll see you at Christmas, I'll be back twice a year, and then I'll come back for the rest of my life. Don't worry, this is temporary. And I went through security, I went around a corner, my parents couldn't see me anymore, and my mom turned to my dad and she said, "He's never coming back." Yeah. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, sit down, sit down, sit down. Thank you very much. Again, thanks to David and to Tim for making this possible. I don't know how this works, but I will tell you, I've just got a few more books, maybe 6 on the back table. They're $20. I'll be happy to sign them. If you'd like one and I run out before you get there, grab one of my business cards and send me an email tonight, and I'll ship you one for the exact same price, signed as well. So any way works. I'll see you on the table